А сейчас позвольте перейти к последнему выступлению. Выступает наш коллега из Израиля, ветеринарный специалист компании Биовак. Он представляет, является консультантом Алма-Атинской птицефабрики, и он расскажет нам о важности гомологии вакцинных и полевых штаммов в вакцинах, а также влияние этих гомологичных штаммов на заражение кур-несушек вирусом болезни Ньюкасла. Да, пожалуйста.
Hello, everybody. I will speak in English today because my talk will be in English. I'm from Israel, and I will talk to you about vaccine to field strain homology, importance and effects. So I represent Biovak, which is a company that manufactures vaccines for poultry and exports these vaccines to Kazakhstan as well and to Russia. We produce in Israel, and we produce in the highest possible standards. Sorry. So in this particular experiment, we used the Newcastle disease virus. Let's hear about the Newcastle disease virus. This is a viral disease harboring single-stranded RNA genome. And it is highly contagious in birds. That means that once one chicken in your flock is infected, the whole flock will be infected. This is an epitheliotropic virus. That means it infects the nervous system, the respiratory system, and the gastrointestinal systems. The major prevention methods is obviously vaccination. This is what we're here to talk about, and biosecurity. That means that you need to watch out who and how much and when people are coming in to touch the birds, because once a flock is infected, you need to kill the whole flock. Just like when you use biosecurity against COVID-19, you put people alone so they will not infect each other. Once a flock is infected, you don't isolate the birds, you just kill them all. This is safer because they're chickens. So in Israel, I don't know the regulations in Kazakhstan. However, in Israel, this is a regulated disease. That means that once a flock is infected, you must kill the flock. You must kill all the birds. That means that a vaccine for that, an efficient vaccine for that disease is highly important from an economic view. So the virus is classified into two classes. Class 1, which is not really virulent, and therefore we're not interested in it. And class 2, which has numerous different genotypes. We have genotype 2, which is the genotype that was isolated from the field in the 1950s, and the viruses from there were attenuated. Means were made weaker and less virulent. So they have been used, the world have been using these vaccine strains for over 30 years now. And that includes the Lasota strain and the VH strain. These preparations are administered as live attenuated vaccines, which makes it easier to apply the vaccine, but it has to be different than the target vaccine. That means that attenuated vaccines are naturally not as homologous to the field strain they are meant to protect against as inactivated vaccines. The main genotype that is isolated in Israel, not only in Israel, in Kazakhstan as well, in Asia, is genotype 7, which is very far away in the phylogenetic tree, very far away genetically, evolutionarily from the attenuated genotype 2 vaccines. When you look at a diagram of the virus itself, you can see a slice of the virion here. This is the single-stranded minus RNA genome. And the main point I want to show you here that only 2 proteins are touching the surroundings, are wrapping the virion and are exposed to the immune system. That means that immunogenically speaking, the only 2 proteins that matter are the H-N protein and the F protein. So let us see if these specific proteins, how similar or how divergent, different from one another they are between genotype 2, the strain that we use for vaccination, and genotype 7, the strains that are isolated in the fields against which we want to protect our chickens. So you can see that we have 87.3 and 88.1 identity in the amino acid sequence. That may seem as a lot, but considering that it's the same proteins, it's very divergent. And all these very different amino acids may cause differentiation in serotype and a differentiation in immunogenicity and a differentiation in the ability of a vaccine to protect. We don't know that yet, but this is what we see. So the hypothesis is that the strains isolated in the 1950s are very different from the strains isolated in the past 2 decades. And that immune protection is a function of homology. That is, the more homologous vaccine is to the target disease is, the more immunity it will get. So what is the immune protection that is lacking now? We're talking about decreased egg production and viral shedding. We witness, there's many papers showing that birds vaccinated with genotype 2 traditional vaccines, the live attenuated vaccines, when they are infected with field strains, genotype 7 strains, they are infected, they show no mortality, they show no clinical signs. However, they lay less eggs, decreased egg production, and they keep on shedding the virus. That is, for weeks after the infection, they keep on shedding vital, virulent genotype 7 virus, and by that, they keep on infecting the whole flock and other flocks, and then you need to destroy many flocks and lose a lot of money. We decided to check this hypothesis by executing an in vivo experiment in chicken layers, chickens producing eggs, a challenge model. So the mythology of the experiment, how it was really done. We have 2 specimens of the 2 genotypes, the VH strain, which is very common genotype 2 live attenuated vaccine, and the genotype 7 vaccine, genotype 7 Newcastle strain that was isolated in Israel in the last decade. So we took chickens, 2 groups of 30 chickens, and we vaccinated them with an inactivated virus. We inactivated the viruses using formaldehyde, and we vaccinated the groups 3 times throughout their growing up stage before they start laying eggs. Then the chickens started laying eggs, and we made sure that we know how many eggs is normal for us to be able to measure correctly the effects of the different vaccination programs, we first needed to have reference set. So after we got the reference, the egg-laying reference set, we transferred the chickens to the challenge facility because we cannot infect chickens with virulent Newcastle disease in the field. We need to contain it biologically, so it was done in a specific biosecure facility. And the challenge is with the same exact strain of genotype 7 field isolate. That means that we have one group, we call it the homologous group, that was vaccinated with 3 doses of inactivated homologous vaccine, while the other group, we call it the heterologous group or the traditional group, was vaccinated throughout. Both groups were vaccinated with the normal vaccine program, everything, and the only difference between the groups is these 3 inactivated vaccines. Then we measured throughout 60 days the mortality, clinical signs, egg laying, and viral shedding from all the groups. So in order to produce protective immunity, a vaccine usually invokes an antibody reaction. That means that we can measure a specific antibody titer, the antibody's quantity, against the specific genotype 7 Newcastle disease virus. And you can see that there is a significant difference in favor of the homologous vaccine group. And this is interesting because in this experiment, we used the HI method with the antigen of genotype 7 strain. And while you measure, if you measure the antibody titer using commercially available ELISA tests, you don't see any significant difference. Why is that? Because the antigen, the trap of the ELISA, the commercial ELISA tests, are genotype 2. So you see that both groups have similar quantity of genotype 2 antibodies, but the homologous vaccine group has many more, significantly more genotype 7 specific neutralizing antibodies. And this higher titer stays for a long time. This previous graph here is shown 21 days, that is 3 weeks after the last administration of the inactivated homologous vaccine. But even 3 months after the application of the last vaccine, you can still see highly, a very clear, highly significant difference between the 2 groups. Regarding mortality and clinical signs, as I said before, the traditional vaccines are sufficient to prevent mortality. So no groups that was vaccinated showed mortality. All the chickens stayed alive, except for the control group that was not vaccinated at all, in which all 12 birds died within 4 days. We witnessed a significant drop in egg production only in the traditionally vaccinated group, only in the hetero group. And we witnessed no other clinical signs as expected. We know that we do not see clinical signs in traditionally vaccinated birds as well, while they're infected with Newcastle. That makes it even harder for the farmers to see and know that their flock is infected, because they see no signs. The birds are not sneezing, everything seems fine with them, and they just lay less eggs, which is the reason they exist for us. They're there to produce eggs. And eventually, if the farmers are forced to see and understand that their birds are infected when they go at the end of the month to sell the eggs and see that they have a lot less. As I said before the challenge, we needed to set the reference and to know how many eggs does a chicken normally lay. And we can see that before the transfer, we had an almost even 1 egg per chicken per day. So we marked the normal, this is the reference. Then we transferred the birds to the challenge facility and let them settle there until they got back to the norm. And then we could challenge them. So this is what I just showed you. This is the pre-transfer and the post-transfer. And now here we challenge. That means we infect all the groups with the genotype 7 strain. And here you can see the massive drop 2 weeks after the challenge, only in the hetero group, only in the traditionally vaccinated group. Note that they are vaccinated. They were vaccinated 7 times against Newcastle disease virus. Okay, and they still, because of the lack of homology, lose almost 30% of their egg-laying ability. And as you can see here, the group that was vaccinated with the homologous inactivated vaccine showed no drop, nothing, no decrease in egg production. The properties of the egg production loss can be seen in the morphology of the eggs. You can see that some eggs were laid without a shell at all. Some eggs were very dysmorphed and small. And then slowly, the ability of these chickens to lay normal eggs came back. It is important to note here that from the 30 chickens of the group that stopped the laying, 20 were not affected. These results show 1/3 of the chickens just stopped laying completely and were laying weird eggs. So this is a fact that I don't know exactly the reason to. It's not wide all through 30% decrease. It's 30% of birds that stop producing eggs. If we look at the normalized egg production loss, we can see very, very clearly around 30% loss when you compare the 2 groups. That is a lot of money lost there. Now we wanted to measure the viral shedding. And that means we don't only want the chickens to lay as many eggs as possible, we want them to not infect one another. So in order to do so, I developed a DIVA system that is differentiating infected from vaccinated animals, because all groups were vaccinated with genotype 2 strains. And after that, all groups were challenged with genotype 7 strains. So how do we know which kind is shed, which kind is dispersed? Because there is evidence that the live attenuated type 2 vaccines are being shed as well. So in order to measure only the virulent type 7, I differentiated 2 TACMan probes by using the slight differences in nucleotide sequence. Here we can see that this system is highly specific. That means when I use this hex probe, I can only detect, this hex probes detects very, very nicely the type 7 strain, the genotype 7, and the probe for the genotype 2 strain does not react with genotype 7 at all, and vice versa. So this is specific. When I measure 7, I measure only 7, and this is what I did here. We can see here on the y-axis, this is the percentage of birds in a group shedding a virus, or that are positive for a virus. Here we tested from the beaks, from the pharynx, and we can see from 4 days until 14 days that about a third of the traditionally vaccinated birds are shedding a virus, much less in the homologous vaccinated group, but still there is shedding. But when you look at shedding from the cloaca, from the feces of the birds, you can see that in the homologous vaccinated group, there is zero shedding, nothing. And reports show that this is the route that usually infects other birds through the cloaca in the feces, because chicken layers are stacked one on the other in cages, and their feces drops on their heads. And this is the way they infect one another. So eliminating viral shedding from the cloaca is key and is essential to prevent infection from one bird to another. Here we can see that 2 weeks after the challenge, both groups now have specific antibodies, specific neutralizing antibodies against genotype 7, which makes sense because the challenge is an exposure to genotype 7 strain. To sum up, the vaccine homologous to the challenge strain protects completely the layers from mortality, clinical signs, and viral shedding against versus the partial protection we see from the traditional heterologous vaccine from genotype 2. More than that, this experiment is a proof of concept. That means now we see that the homology in the context of Newcastle disease virus is essential. And we are now working on developing a new, better vaccine preparation to completely solve the egg-laying problem that we witness in Israel and elsewhere in the world. So we're working on a new vaccine that will not be inactivated even. It will be fully homologous, but not inactivated. And looking at things in a grander way, more generally, homology is the key for protective immunity. And if I wish to connect it to our current situation with the COVID-19, that you have the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines that all the world is now asking, are they efficacious against these mutations or that mutations? Homology is key. Maybe Pfizer will make another vaccine that has the sequence of the newly mutated viruses to have protective immunity against them as well. But this experiment really portrays the issue that live or dead is not enough. These chickens were protected against mortality, but they still were infective. They still had some signs in egg laying. You can make the comparisons to other fields in immunology and vaccinology. Thank you all for listening, and I would love to answer some questions if you have.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое.
Any questions? I'd love to answer.
Если есть вопросы, задавайте. Если нет, значит... Вопросов я не вижу в чате. Спасибо большое за выступление. Дорогие коллеги, на этом мы, наверное, заканчиваем работу нашего вебинара. Значит, последнее выступление будет переведено. Значит, каждому из вас будут отправлены ссылки. Значит, там, где вы регистрировались сегодня на птицы онлайн, значит, в Ютубе, на сайте Росптицесоюза, на сайте птицеводов Казахстана, на сайте птицеводов Республики Беларусь будет выложена запись данного вебинара, и вы всегда можете по ссылке прийти и посмотреть те выступления, которые вас заинтересовали. Спасибо большое всем за участие. Всего доброго. Последующие семинары будут в марте, потом в апреле. Будут посвящены пищевым токсикоинфекциям, высокопатогенному гриппу птиц, болезни Ньюкасла, ну и другим проблемам, которые нас сегодня беспокоят. Всего доброго.